Lena had always been an unconventional woman, a free spirit, some would say, with a charm that could captivate anyone in her path. Her marriage to Rick was something most people would have raised an eyebrow at. Rick, her husband, was the complete opposite, quiet, reserved, and thoughtful. But together they made it work. Or so it seemed. Rick and Lena had been married for 12 years. Their relationship had always been unique. From the very beginning, they agreed on something many people would never understand: an open marriage. They had mutual trust and a clear understanding that their love would not be confined to traditional expectations. They had been together through highs and lows, building a life that was, in their eyes, more progressive and free than the conventional relationships around them. Their son Nathan was the product of a previous relationship of Lena's. A young man of 24 now, Nathan had lived with them for most of his life. He was a smart, capable young man, quiet like his father, but with an edge of rebellion. Unlike Rick, Nathan wasn't completely content with the open nature of their marriage, though he never expressed it directly. He preferred a different kind of attention, one that Lena seemed to provide in abundance. Over the years, Rick grew increasingly indifferent to the arrangements they had, perhaps due to his busy work life, or maybe simply because he had come to accept the nature of their bond. Lena, on the other hand, was restless. The open marriage had been her idea, but as time passed, she found herself growing more possessive of certain relationships, specifically with Nathan. It started innocently enough. A few playful comments, a casual touch here and there. But what had been playful soon turned into something more. Nathan was aware of his mother's affection, but he never really thought much of it. She had always been affectionate toward him, and he had never thought to question her intentions. But as the months wore on, he began to notice things. The way she looked at him sometimes, her lingering touch when she passed him in the hallway. It made him uncomfortable, but he brushed it aside as just his imagination running wild. But Lena's persistence began to grow. She found ways to be alone with Nathan more often, always seeking his attention in subtle, yet undeniable ways. She would often make up excuses to stay in his room longer than necessary, bringing up topics that felt more personal than a mother should talk to her son about. Nathan would feel the unease, but it wasn't until one evening, when she cornered him in the kitchen, that it became impossible to ignore. "Lena, what is this about?" Nathan finally asked, his voice shaky. Lena smiled, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of passion and desperation. "Nathan, please don't stop what we've started. You felt it too, haven't you? Don't pretend like this doesn't mean something to you." Nathan took a step back, shaking his head. "This isn't right, Mom. This has to stop." But Lena wasn't willing to back down. Her desires had consumed her, and she could not let go. "You don't understand. I can't live without this. You're the only one who makes me feel alive. Please don't turn away from me." Nathan, now feeling trapped and disgusted, pushed past her and left the house. He couldn't wrap his mind around what was happening. It felt like everything he knew was being turned upside down. What had started as an unconventional marriage had turned into something dark, something dangerous. And Lena was at the center of it all. Lena, however, was determined. She could not imagine a life without Nathan's touch, without his presence in her life in the way she had come to expect. She couldn't bear the thought of losing him, so she would stop at nothing to keep him close. The days that followed Nathan's escape from the kitchen were filled with an air of unspoken tension. At first, it seemed like life would return to normal, as if nothing had happened. Lena tried to act as though she hadn't just made a desperate plea, as though she hadn't overstepped the boundaries of a mother's love. But inside, something had shifted. Something dark and unrelenting was growing in her mind, a force she could no longer ignore. Nathan, on the other hand, was a mess. His thoughts spiraled out of control as he tried to process the events of that night. How could he face his mother after what had happened? How could he look at her without seeing the hunger in her eyes, the desperation that he could not erase from his memory? It felt like his entire world was falling apart, like the foundation of his very existence was crumbling beneath him. He tried to talk to his father, Rick, but the older man had always been distant. He could never quite communicate with Rick the way he needed to. Rick was wrapped up in his own work, his own life, and when Nathan tried to express his discomfort about the growing strain between him and Lena, Rick simply shrugged it off. "Your mother is just being herself," he said with a soft chuckle. "She loves you, Nathan. Nothing wrong with that. She just needs to express it in her own way." But Nathan knew it wasn't just about love anymore. It was something else, something darker, that he couldn't put into words. His mother's behavior had crossed a line, and now it felt like the walls of their home were closing in on him. Lena, sensing Nathan's distance, became even more determined. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not when he had become the only thing that brought her a sense of purpose. Her need for him became consuming, overwhelming. She began showing up unannounced at his workplace, pretending to drop by to check in on him. She'd call him at odd hours, acting as though everything was perfectly normal, that they hadn't shared that intimate, disturbing moment. One evening, after Rick had gone to bed, Lena found herself unable to sleep. She wandered into Nathan's room, quietly opening the door. Her heart raced as she looked at him, sleeping soundly. For a moment, she wondered if she was losing her mind, if what she was doing was wrong. But then the thought passed, and she crept closer to him. She leaned down, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling. Nathan stirred slightly but didn't wake. His breath was steady, and his expression was peaceful. He looked so young, so innocent, and Lena felt a pang of longing that nearly broke her. But then the guilt hit her like a slap. She had to stop this. She had to let him go. As she pulled away, she noticed something on Nathan's desk, a small notebook. Curiosity piqued. She couldn't resist opening it. The pages were filled with scribbled thoughts and sketches, nothing too revealing until she reached the last page. There, written in bold letters, was one sentence that froze her blood. "I can't take this anymore. I'll find a way out." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The weight of those words sank deep into her chest. Nathan was planning to leave. He was going to run away from her, from everything they had built together. He couldn't do that. She couldn't let him. She knew she had to act fast. If Nathan left, everything she had worked for would collapse. She would lose him forever. In that moment, a dark thought flashed across her mind, a thought she had never entertained before. What if she could make Nathan stay? What if there was a way to force him into submission, to make him see that there was no other choice but to be with her? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She had to find a way to make him stay, no matter the cost. And if she had to manipulate, threaten, or coerce him into doing so, then that was exactly what she would do. Meanwhile, Rick remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his household. He had been so consumed by his own life that he hadn't noticed the slow unraveling of his family. The cracks were appearing, but they were invisible to him, hidden behind the walls that Lena and Nathan had so carefully constructed. As Lena sat in the dimly lit room, staring at Nathan's notebook, she made a silent vow. No one would take Nathan from her, not Rick, not anyone. She would make sure of that. The days that followed Nathan's unsettling discovery in the notebook were filled with a strange, quiet sort of tension. Lena's mind raced with a mix of determination and fear as she began to hatch her plan. She had already done so much to keep Nathan close, but this time she had to make him understand, really understand, that there was no escape. Her obsession had reached a fever pitch, and her obsession would not let go. Nathan, still shaken by the realization that his mother was slipping further into something he couldn't grasp, became more withdrawn. He barely spoke to Lena, and when they did interact, there was an undercurrent of discomfort between them. The silent distance between mother and son grew longer with each passing day, but neither could truly bridge the gap. He could not bring himself to confront her directly, and she was too consumed by her own desires to acknowledge the harm she was causing. Rick, as usual, remained oblivious to the storm. He had no idea how much trouble his family was in. He continued to work long hours, retreating to his study when he was home, leaving Nathan and Lena to figure things out on their own. Lena would often tell Rick that everything was fine, that they were just going through a rough patch. But in her heart, she knew better. This wasn't just a rough patch, it was a collapse, and she was doing everything in her power to prevent it. Lena knew she had to be strategic. She couldn't let Nathan leave, not without first ensuring he understood how crucial their bond was. She waited for the right moment, one where she could approach him without raising suspicion. It came one night when Rick was away on a business trip, and she knew she would have Nathan to herself. Nathan had been spending more time out of the house, getting away from the suffocating atmosphere that had taken over. It wasn't enough to keep the thoughts of his mother's advances at bay, but at least it provided a small sense of relief. He hadn't planned to be home that evening, but after a long day at work, he came back to find the house eerily quiet. He walked through the front door, closing it behind him, not even bothering to check the clock. He wasn't sure what to do next. Lena appeared from the shadows of the living room, her eyes narrowing as she took in his weary expression. "You're home early," she remarked casually, but there was something in her voice that made Nathan uneasy. I, I was just thinking," Nathan stammered, not sure how to explain the disarray in his mind. "It's nothing." Lena stepped closer, her gaze lingering on him, analyzing him with a cold, calculating stare. "Nathan," she began softly, her voice almost soothing, "you don't have to hide from me. I know what's going on. You're upset about what happened. But this can work out. We can still be close." Nathan recoiled slightly, his discomfort turning into something deeper, an instinct to run, to escape this suffocating web she was weaving. "Mom, please," he whispered. "We need to stop. We need to stop everything." Lena ignored his plea, taking another step toward him. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. "You don't understand," she said, her tone more insistent now, her hand trembling slightly. "I can't live without you. You're everything to me. Don't leave me, Nathan. Please, don't leave me." Nathan jerked away, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to shout, to tell her that she had crossed a line he could never forgive. But instead he stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of her words. "You're sick, Mom," he finally spat, his voice shaking with anger. "I'm not staying here. I won't let you control me." Lena's expression faltered for a moment, but then it hardened. The calmness in her voice returned, but there was a chilling undercurrent to her words. "You think you can leave, Nathan? You think you can run away from me?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "I've given you everything. I've raised you. I've been there for you. And this is how you repay me? By abandoning me when I need you the most?" Nathan opened his mouth to argue, but Lena cut him off, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "You don't get to walk away. I will make sure of that." Nathan felt the air grow cold around him as his mother's words sank in. A sense of dread gripped his chest. He knew he couldn't stay in this house much longer. He couldn't stand to be near her, couldn't bear the thought of what might happen next if he didn't get away. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the fear that had begun to creep into his thoughts. Lena was capable of anything. The next morning, Nathan did what he had always done when things got too overwhelming. He packed a bag and left. This time, though, he had a different plan. He was going to get out of this house for good. He would stay with a friend, someone who would keep him safe. He would stay away from Lena, from everything that had happened, until he could figure out what to do next. The confrontation in the hallway, as brief as it was, had a lasting impact on Nathan. The moment Rick stepped into the room and blocked his path, everything about his plan to leave shattered. His escape, which had once felt like the only solution, now seemed impossible. Rick's cold demeanor, his words that felt more like a command than a question, left Nathan feeling trapped and powerless. Lena, standing in the background, watched with a subtle smirk, almost as if she had expected this moment to come. There was something calculating in her eyes, something dangerous that Nathan could not fully grasp. For the first time, he realized how deeply tangled the threads of manipulation and control were between his mother and Rick. It was as if they had become co-conspirators in his imprisonment, and the very idea of leaving seemed laughable. Nathan stood frozen, staring at Rick, who seemed to scrutinize him as though he were a suspect in some unknown crime. There was no warmth in Rick's eyes, no sign of concern for the son he had raised. Nathan had grown used to his father's indifference, but this was something else, a chilling realization that Rick had sided with Lena. He had always assumed his father was just absent-minded, not actively part of the toxic bond that had formed between him and Lena. But now, standing before him, Rick's cold eyes betrayed something darker. Rick's voice broke the silence. "What's going on, Nathan?" You think you can just pack up and leave like that? You're not some child anymore. You don't get to make decisions on a whim. Nathan opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Lena intervened. Rick, let's not make this harder than it already is, she said, her tone deceptively calm. She stepped forward and laid a hand gently on Nathan's shoulder, her fingers barely brushing his skin. Nathan's just going through a phase. He'll understand, won't you, sweetie? She cooed, her voice a mixture of sweetness and threat. Nathan recoiled at her touch, his skin crawling with disgust. I'm not going through any phase, he snapped. I'm not staying here. This, this isn't healthy. You're both acting like I don't have a say in my own life. You don't own me, Mom. Lena's face shifted in an instant, her calm demeanor replaced with a cold fury. She stepped back, eyes flashing. You'll stay, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I've done everything for you, Nathan. You don't get to leave me. Not now. Not ever. Nathan took a step back, his heart pounding. The weight of her words lingered in the air, suffocating him. He knew his mother was capable of manipulation, but this felt different. He didn't know how far she would go, but he could feel that he was walking on a dangerous edge. Rick, as always, remained silent, watching the exchange with detached indifference. His eyes flickered toward Lena, then back to Nathan, but there was no sign of the fatherly concern Nathan had longed for. It was as if he too had been drawn into Lena's web of control and obsession, unable or unwilling to break free. Nathan's mind raced, but he couldn't come up with a single way to escape. His mother's grip on him was tightening, and Rick's cold presence made it even harder to think clearly. He needed to get out, but with every step he took toward the door, it felt like the walls of the house were closing in on him. The atmosphere in the house had shifted. The once spacious rooms now felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in with every passing moment. Even the air seemed thicker, heavier, as if it carried the weight of the secrets that were being buried within it. Nathan knew that if he stayed in this house any longer, it wouldn't just destroy his sense of freedom, it would break him. But what choice did he have? Without Rick's support, he had no way to leave safely. And with his mother now standing as the sole barrier between him and his escape, he couldn't help but wonder if leaving would even be possible. His mind churned, but the answers remained elusive. It seemed like his only option was to play along, to pretend that everything was fine, until he could figure out a way to escape. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between mother and son grew. Nathan tried to keep his distance, spending more time outside the house, visiting friends, and seeking any form of normalcy that could help him cope with the increasingly toxic environment. But no matter where he went, Lena seemed to be watching. She would show up at odd times, sometimes at his workplace, sometimes at the local coffee shop, always wearing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Nathan couldn't escape her presence, and no matter how much he tried to avoid her, she was always there, hovering, watching, waiting. Her attempts to control him only grew more desperate as the days passed. She began sending him constant messages, texts, and emails, each one more insistent than the last. The days that followed the chilling text were filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Nathan felt like he was living in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. His mind raced with one thought: escape. But with every passing day, that escape seemed more and more out of reach. Lena's grip on him had tightened, and Rick's indifference only made things worse. Nathan was no longer sure who was worse, his obsessive mother or the father who had turned a blind eye to her actions. The house had become a prison. Every room felt suffocating. Every glance from Lena sent shivers down his spine. He couldn't escape her reach, not even for a moment. She followed him everywhere, always watching, always waiting. He had tried to meet up with a friend, hoping for a distraction, but even then, he couldn't shake the feeling that his mother was lurking just out of sight, ready to pull him back into her suffocating web. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, where the silence at the table felt oppressive, Nathan had had enough. He couldn't live like this anymore. He needed to leave. He needed to get away from Lena and Rick before it drove him mad. The idea of staying in the house one more night was unbearable. He had been considering leaving for weeks, but now, the thought of actually doing it filled him with a strange sense of urgency. Lena, as always, had been watching him closely throughout dinner. Her gaze never left him. Her smile stretched thin as she waited for him to acknowledge her. She knew he was on the edge, knew he was close to breaking, and she couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when she had worked so hard to keep him. When dinner ended, Nathan excused himself, saying he needed to get some air. He didn't wait for a response from either of his parents. He simply walked out the front door and into the night. The cool evening breeze felt like a lifeline as he stepped away from the house. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, not really sure where he was going. His mind was clouded with thoughts of escape, of freedom. But there was a part of him that was terrified of what would happen when he left the house. What would his mother do? What lengths would she go to keep him from leaving? The fear was real, gnawing at him, but the need to be free was stronger. As he walked, Nathan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out. It was a message from Lena. His stomach dropped as he read it. "You can't run away from me, Nathan. You belong here. You're mine. I'll do whatever it takes to make you stay." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration of ownership. Nathan's pulse quickened as his mind raced. He had been right to fear her. She wouldn't let him go. She would do anything to keep him under her control. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to leave, and he needed to do it now. Without another thought, he turned on his heel and headed for the bus station. He had no plan, no destination in mind. He just knew that he couldn't stay in that house another minute. Back at the house, Lena was waiting. She had known Nathan would try to escape. She had known the moment he left the dinner table. Rick, as usual, was oblivious to the tension building in the house. He had been watching television, lost in his own world. But Lena's instincts never failed her. She knew Nathan had left, and she knew exactly where he was going. Lena's thoughts were cold and calculating as she watched the minutes tick by. She had to act fast. She couldn't let Nathan leave. Not now, not after everything she had done to keep him close. She couldn't lose him, not when he was the only thing that made her feel alive. She grabbed her phone and sent one final message to Nathan. The message would be the last one he would ever receive from her. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. "You can't leave me, Nathan. I will make sure of it. I will make you stay." Nathan had no idea what was coming. He was too far gone, too desperate to escape to realize that Lena had already taken her first step in ensuring he never would. Later that night, when Nathan was sitting at the bus station, trying to decide what to do next, he received a call. The number was unknown, but something inside him told him it was her. It was Lena. He answered it, his heart pounding in his chest. "Nathan," Lena's voice came through the phone, soft but chilling. "I know what you're trying to do. You think you can leave me and everything will be fine. But you're wrong. I won't let you go. You belong to me." Nathan's hand trembled as he held the phone. He wanted to hang up, but he couldn't. There was something in Lena's voice, a quiet menace that froze him in place. "You're my son, Nathan," she continued. "I've given everything for you, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you. Do you hear me? Whatever it takes." The next few days blurred into a haze of anxiety for Nathan. He had fled the house, but the sense of freedom he had so desperately sought quickly turned into a prison of its own. Despite being away from Lena, the weight of her presence followed him everywhere. He couldn't shake her voice, her words, the cold promises she had made. There was no safe space for him anymore. Every thought was clouded by the threat she had issued. Whatever it takes. It felt like an invisible chain, tugging him back to her, wherever he went. Meanwhile, Lena's carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel in ways she had never anticipated. Rick, oblivious to the depths of his wife's manipulations, continued his detached existence. He was wrapped up in his work and his hobbies, unable to see the gradual destruction of his family. But things were changing, and he was about to be drawn into the investigation, one that would expose the darkness lurking in the house he had always considered his safe haven. It wasn't until the police arrived at the house that the first cracks in Lena's armor began to show. They came at the behest of a concerned neighbor who had heard shouting from inside the house late one night. The neighbor had been suspicious for weeks, noticing the increasingly erratic behavior of the family. But it was the raised voices that prompted them to finally take action. They had called the authorities, fearing something was terribly wrong. Detective Claire Mendez was assigned to the case. She was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach to solving cases. As she entered the house, she immediately noticed the tension in the air. The house was immaculate, as always, but there was a heaviness to it, a kind of quiet that spoke louder than any words. Rick greeted her at the door, his face blank, almost emotionless. He hadn't expected the visit, but when the detective introduced herself and explained the reason for the investigation, he immediately complied. He led her inside and showed her to the living room, where Lena sat with a calm expression, her hands neatly folded in her lap. Detective Mendez immediately sized up the situation. She had seen this kind of facade before. There was something off about this family. The unease in the air, the stiffness of the couple, the way they avoided looking at each other, it all added up to a story that had yet to be told. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the detective began, her voice steady but authoritative. We received a complaint about some disturbances here. Your neighbor mentioned hearing some shouting from inside. Care to explain? Lena's gaze flickered, but only for a second. She quickly recovered and offered a polite smile. Oh, that, she said with a laugh, brushing it off. It's just some family tension. Nothing serious, detective. We're going through a rough patch, but I assure you everything is fine. Rick nodded absent-mindedly in agreement. He didn't seem particularly concerned, his response as detached as ever. It's nothing to worry about, he echoed. We're just going through a bit of a phase. It'll blow over. Detective Mendez studied them carefully, her sharp eyes catching every detail. She didn't buy their story, but she knew better than to push too hard just yet. Instead, she asked to speak with their son, Nathan. Rick hesitated. Nathan isn't home at the moment. He's been staying with a friend. Detective Mendez raised an eyebrow. Is that so? How long has he been staying away? A few days, Rick answered, his tone neutral. He's been upset about some things. We're giving him space, Lena added, her voice strained with forced sweetness. He'll be back soon. Nathan just needs time to sort things out. The detective's intuition told her there was more to this than met the eye. She had seen cases like this before. Families where something darker lurked beneath the surface. She needed to find out more. I'll need to speak with Nathan when he gets back, she said. It's important that I understand what's really going on here. Lena's smile faltered, but she quickly masked her concern with a pleasant nod. Of course, we'll make sure he knows you're looking for him. But Detective Mendez was already sensing that Nathan was more than just upset. The way his parents reacted, the way they tried to downplay the situation, it all pointed to a much deeper issue. And the more she observed them, the more she began to feel that something sinister had happened in this house, something that had yet to be fully uncovered. Over the next few days, the detective made discreet inquiries. She reached out to Nathan's friends trying to track him down, but no one had heard from him. His absence, combined with the strange tension in the house, was raising red flags. Detective Mendez also dug into the family's past, pulling up old police reports and social media posts. What she found was unsettling. The walls were closing in on Lena and Rick. Detective Mendez had gathered enough to know that what had initially seemed like a simple family dispute was, in fact, much darker. The threads of manipulation, obsession, and secrecy that had run through the Carter household for years were now exposed. But what the detective didn't expect was the sudden escalation of events. It had been nearly a week since Nathan went missing, and despite his parents' assurances to the authorities that he was simply taking some time away, the detective knew that something had gone terribly wrong. Nathan was nowhere to be found, and the tension in the Carter house was palpable. Rick had remained quiet throughout the investigation, giving little to no information, while Lena had been eerily calm, perhaps too calm. As the days passed, her demeanor became more defensive, more paranoid. She no longer smiled as she once did, no longer played the role of the devoted mother who had simply lost her son. She had become erratic, her voice slipping into anger when questioned too directly. It was clear to Detective Mendez that Lena was hiding something. In the early hours of the morning, the investigation took a new turn. A neighbor, the same one who had called the police initially, reached out to Detective Mendez again, urgently. The call came at an hour when most people were still asleep, but there was a frantic edge in the neighbor's voice. Something had happened. The neighbor had heard strange noises coming from the Carter house late that night. Thumping, loud crashes, followed by complete silence. The neighbor had tried to reach out, but no one had answered. It was enough to prompt Mendez to act. At dawn, the detective arrived at the Carter residence, accompanied by a team of officers. They were ready to search the house, and this time, there would be no polite deflections from Rick or Lena. They would find the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Lena answered the door, her eyes narrowing as she saw the officers standing behind Mendez. She had been expecting this, but nothing could prepare her for what was coming. Her calm, controlled facade cracked for a split second, revealing something far darker behind her eyes: panic, fear, and a desperate need to maintain control. "Detective, what is this about?" Lena asked, her voice unsteady. "We have reason to believe that Nathan is in danger," Mendez said, her voice firm. "We are conducting a search. Please step aside." Lena's expression faltered, but she didn't protest. She stepped back, allowing the officers inside. The house was eerily quiet, the usual tension thick in the air. It was as though everything was waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Rick was still asleep in his room, and when he woke to the sight of the officers, he was disoriented and groggy. "What's going on?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "We're looking for your son, Mr. Carter," Mendez said, her eyes meeting his. "It's time we had a talk about what's really been happening here." Rick blinked, his confusion mounting. "What are you talking about?" "Nathan's not here. He's been gone for days." But something in his voice sounded off, almost too rehearsed. It didn't take long for the detective to realize that Rick wasn't as uninvolved as he had appeared. His behavior now suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "Where is he, Rick?" Mendez pressed, her gaze unyielding. Lena, who had been standing silently in the hallway, suddenly interjected, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't understand. We're just a family going through a rough time. Nathan will come back when he's ready. He needs space. He's fine." But Mendez wasn't convinced. The pieces were starting to come together. She had spoken to Adam, and now she was piecing together Nathan's fears. His mother's possessiveness, the strange relationship that had bordered on obsession, the isolation Nathan had described. The detective couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something far more sinister had been taking place within the walls of this house. The officers began their search upstairs, methodical and thorough. Mendez stayed downstairs, watching Lena closely, noticing the way she fidgeted with her hands, the nervous glance she shot toward the hallway, as if she were waiting for something, or someone, to return. Then came the sound of the officers yelling. Mendez's heart dropped as she rushed upstairs to see what had happened. She found two officers standing in front of a locked door at the end of the hallway. They had found something that none of them were prepared for. The officers had forced the door open, and what they discovered made their stomachs turn. In the corner of the room, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes and sheets, was a blood-stained mattress. The smell hit them first, foul and rancid. They uncovered the evidence, piece by piece: a broken chair, some torn pieces of fabric, and finally Nathan's belongings, stuffed hastily into a box.